I've been teaching in this area of youth and young adult faith since 2005, and in that time, there hasn't been a work on ministry with adolescents within a Catholic framework. And so there was a need for this book simply in my own coursework. And I presume that if it was needed in my own coursework, it would be needed in other people's coursework in other institutions. And so part of the need was for that, but also it pushed me to think about how do we think about youth and young adult ministry within the Catholic context. There are other books in the area of youth ministry, but they're for the most part coming out of Reformed Church experience, where there's been a long history of youth ministry and youth groups and youth pastors. In the Catholic world, there are youth groups, but it's a smaller phenomenon, and it's a recent phenomenon. On the other hand, Catholics have been ministering to adolescents and young adults consistently in secondary schools, in parish settings, and in higher education settings. And so I needed to have a book that also thought about how do we think about ministry in those diversified settings and not simply think about ministry as youth group work or just parish-based work, even though that's very important work on its own. So the ecclesial setting was different. There's also a different theological worldview that was important to consider. And the Reform worldview has a different sense of the human person and different sense of sin and grace. And I wanted to say, well, what does it mean to write about the experience of adolescence and our ministry with adolescents within a theological framework that's a Catholic theological framework with a Catholic sensibility about the human person and the human person's relationship to God. In the book, I name adolescence as a project, and that's a major project of moving from what I call the instrumental place of childhood to the more relational demands of adulthood. Now, sociologists over the last number of decades have started subdividing that long stretch into different pieces, and that's fine, that's their work. But my work was to say, what does it take to move from childhood to adulthood? And so I'm looking at it in this book from a developmental psychology perspective and a sociological perspective. And so that's how I'll speak to it in this moment. In childhood, we have limited cognitive capacity to see ourselves located in the world. Yet in adulthood, we're expected to be able to locate ourselves in the world and to behave appropriately in those settings, whatever those settings may be, whether those settings are employment, whether they're intimate relationships, family relationships, friends, and even strangers on the street. There's an expectation that adults know how to behave. And so in the book, one of the things I do is name adulthood as the capacity to be responsible within the context of relationships. Children don't do that. Children know they can do right or wrong given a list of things that they should or shouldn't do. But adults are supposed to be able to figure out, what is it I'm supposed to do in this situation? To whom am I responsible? How do I behave? And I'm arguing that adolescence is that task or that project of getting there, moving from that more unself-consciously self-interested place of childhood to the place of adulthood where you are aware of and responsible to those many relationships in which you are embedded. So throughout the book, I'm arguing that adolescence then is that project of moving from that instrumental engagement with the world to a more relational engagement with the world. And it's not an inevitable development. Some people age and never lose an instrumental sense of the world. In fact, that's their primary way of focusing on it. So what are the tasks then of that project? The tasks, I suggest, are fourfold. One is to see yourself as a person, and that rises with the capacity of self-consciousness. To see yourself as a person of value and particularity in the world. The second is to see other people as persons and not as things to be moved around or to manipulate, but as human persons with their own hopes and desires and understandings and dreams. And the third is to recognize that between yourself and this other person is this thing called a relationship that's neither me nor you, but it's something between us. And it requires its own care and maintenance. And to move into adulthood is to be able to recognize that there are things that we do for the sake of a relationship that are not immediately beneficial to just me or just you. Right? So parents will do things for the family that they don't necessarily find immediately self-beneficial, but they're doing it for the sake of the family. They're doing it for the sake of their children's lives, right? Even at the same time, the child may not see that it is immediately beneficial to them, but it's beneficial to the life of the family, okay? So being able to recognize that relational space is a tremendous developmental jump that children are not able to do, but adolescents are being asked to take on that capacity to see the relationship. So to see oneself, to see the other, to see the relationship that's between us. And the fourth piece is to recognize that that's all interpretive. How do I understand myself as a human person? What value do I place on myself? And what value do I place on the other? Do I see them as something valuable, or do I see them as something detrimental? And then how do I understand what relationships should be about? So it's this fourfold capacity that we have the ability to develop in adolescence. It's not inevitable that we develop any of those, right? And that are expected of successful adult, mature behavior in the world. What's interesting for me in this work is be able to say this isn't just a cognitive developmental task, but it's also to say there's a theological framework that helps us understand what it is we're about. Within the Catholic theological worldview, we understand the human person is always in relationship with God. That we are creatures, God is the creator. And our limitedness as human persons is largely because we're creatures, right? Not that we're the creator. And so by nature of being creatures, we're limited. I can't see everything, I can't know everything, I can't be everything. But one of the things that I can learn to do is to recognize that I am not an isolated entity, but I am in relationship. My primary relationship is my relationship with God that informs everything else. But more immediately, I can see that I'm in relationship with my family members, with my friends, with intimate others, with work colleagues, with roommates, with employers, and so forth. To recognize those relationships as such is a beneficial thing, and because it then grows the capacity to grow into those relationships. In my work, I'm using the work of Karl Rahner, Catherine LaCugna, John Zizioulas, Elizabeth Johnson, and Edward Hannenberg, all who talk about God's constant presence in the human experience and in the experience of being a creature. All of them also talk about how that experience of relationship can be enhanced as we lean into the relationship, as we recognize it and grow into it. And we talk about that as grace. So what I'm saying theologically is that as the adolescent begins to recognize that they're in relationships, they can actually move into growing those relationships, which they're naturally inclined to do. We are made to be in relationships. And when we move into and grow those relationships, we then expand the capacity for grace, we expand the capacity for love, and we flourish. So the human person, as we argue within the Catholic theological world, is made to be in relationship, is made in relationship, and it's recognizing that and growing into it that the human person continues to flourish. Now, while the human person is made to be in relationship, there's a lot about our contemporary living that works against that being a natural thing to do. And in the book, I identify what I'm calling two major pieces. One is the cultural individualism, and the other are the structures of isolation. So within the United States, North America writ large, we talk about the individual person, the individual flourishing. And when the language around this was first conceived of a few hundred years ago, we had around us social structures that we presumed. So the church, the local community, the family. Okay? And so as we spoke about the individual, it was an individual presumed within social structures that supported that individual and largely framed that person's life. Now we get to the 21st century, Those social structures do not exist in the same way that they did a few hundred years ago. Yet all we have is this language around the individual. And so we still say, well, the individual, without a sense of the essential nature of the communal structures around it. A couple of things happen because of that. One is that the individual begins to think that their life is an individual project. I do this by myself, for myself, and it's not. Again, going back to the theological rootings of this, we talk about the human person being made in relationship. And John Zizioulas, in particular, talks about our unique personhood is discovered in relationship with other people. It's not until somebody looks at us and says, yes, you're the valuable one here, that we begin to see in ourselves our ultimate value and uniqueness as a person. So our value as a human person is not something I can claim for myself by myself. It actually requires other people to tell me that I'm valuable. Once that happens for a person, then they begin to kind of grow into that and flourish. And hopefully it happens more than once. So the individualism in the world, in our culture, that tells me that this is my own project, that I do this by myself, tells the individual not to enter into a relationship. You don't need them. There's so much baggage. They're in the way. Okay? And that's contrary to the development of the human person. They actually need other people to be themselves. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is what have grown over the last couple of centuries with the practices of modernism and the industrial complex and the way cities have been built, and we have moved from being a more agrarian people to a more citified people, urban people. And our work days have become longer, and our commuting has become more part of the project. We work further away from home. That our lives have become more isolated from one another. So families become isolated from other families, but also within families, members of those families become isolated from each other. And one of the things we've become used to, but I'd suggest in fact is rather abnormal, is across human history, is schooling, which has not that educating is abnormal, but the abnormal format where we have age-segregated schooling that now we've had in place for about a century, schooling through adolescence, where you're only with your age group. That format has also been part of the segregating or isolating nature of our lives. And we've taken it as normal because we've been living with it for about a century, but over the span of human history, it's in fact rather abnormal and an aberration to the more communal ways humans have raised humans in time. One of the things I argue in the book is that for a person to move from the more instrumental place of childhood to the more relational place of adulthood, they actually require relationships to learn this stuff. They require people who say to them in one way or another, if you want to be in relationship with me, you got to clean up your act and you got to be less self-involved and more attentive to the people around you. Whether the person who says it is family or friends or an employer or whomever it is, it's somebody who actually requires you to pay attention to the other and the relationship. So when you're working in a world where the culture says the individual should do this growing up stuff on their own, and you're working also in a world where there are structures of isolation, I'm arguing that there are fewer and fewer of those relationships happening naturally, happening organically. And so I'm arguing for our attentiveness to what I'm calling robust relationships. And those are relationships within which the individual adolescent can have a sense of being seen for who they really are, valued in the person who's seen, and known, So seen, known, and valued, I think, are the essential elements of a robust relationship. It calls the individual to reveal themselves a little bit more once they've been seen so that the other can know who they really are. And in that knowing, be affirmed and valued for who they really are, which then again continues to grow and to flourish if that's encouraged. Okay. But in a world of individualism and isolation, what we have are adolescents who are more and more feeling that that's exactly what they shouldn't do, that they shouldn't reveal themselves to others, that the revelation is too costly and too public and too potentially dangerous to them. Right? And so what I'm asking ministers and communities to think about is, do you create settings where robust relationships, where adolescents can be seen, known, and valued for who they really are? Can you look at your settings and say, can these happen naturally where you are? Or are we creating one more setting of isolation and individualism where this is unlikely to happen? I chose the metaphor of sailing, so not only in the title, Navigating Toward Adulthood, but the metaphor of sailing runs throughout the book. I learned to sail about 10 years ago, and I realized it's actually a really complex, simple yet complex endeavor, and deeply enjoyable. But it comes in part out of a comment that one of my brothers made. He and I were talking about another family member who had, in many ways, failed to launch into adulthood well, and he had said, it's like he doesn't know that he's in the driver's seat of his own life. He's still sitting in the back seat, waiting for somebody else to drive the car. And I said, that's a really great image. But I thought about it more and said, it is a great image. But driving, as we understand it, presumes roads, traffic lights, signage, rules that people follow. They have to get a license before they do it, all sorts of things. It presumes gravity. It presumes the ground's going to stay still while we travel over it. Life isn't like that, though. Life is chaotic. Life is always moving. It's never sitting still. There are very few clear signposts and curbs and pavement. Instead, life is shifting and in flux constantly. And so what you need to learn how to do as an adult is be able to read the atmosphere around you, read the context around you, make sense of it, and succeed. Sailing depends on what are largely invisible forces, wind and current. Now, you can't see wind, and you also can't see current, but you can see the effect of wind and current on each other by looking at other signs. And similarly, when you're growing into a relational sensibility, you have to learn how to see invisible things, like relationships, like values, like intention. And those invisible things have concrete clues that you can pay attention to, but the clues are not the thing. But you need to learn how to read that. So in many ways, I've discovered as I was pursuing this metaphor, moving to adulthood is a lot like learning how to sail. It's a lot like learning how to pay attention to the visible signs in order to perceive the invisible realities that are necessary for success.